Hey, what's going on, roleplayers? It's the Bard here, and welcome back to the corner. So today I thought I'd talk about spells a little bit. So I ran across this comment where someone asked, what are my go-to spells? A very interesting question, but an enormous task to answer. I don't think you can just say, you should take this spell, and then that spell, and then another spell, and be done with it. I think it honestly depends on what your class is, and what your function is within the party, and what it is you're intending to do as a character. So what I thought might make it a little easier is if I went through my go-to spells based on my role in the party. I can't seem to find the original comment, however, but nevertheless it's given me some interesting things to think about, and hopefully there's some ideas here that you might take advantage of as well when you're gaming. So I'm going to start out with my absolute favourite, which is utility spells. As a cleric, as a wizard, as a bard, I personally feel that it's not your job to be doing damage. You can leave that to the rogues and the fighters in the group. With the way cantrips work in 5th edition, everything is progressing. They're always getting a little bit better. So you don't really need to spend as much time or as much effort on your damaging spell selection, and you can concentrate more on utility and quality of life spells. So when it comes to arcane casters, I personally think that Unseen Servant is one of the best spells you will ever get. Simply because not only is it so functional and so useful, but you can also cast it as a ritual as well. This spell can do so much, and it really just shows just how creative a player can be when they take full advantage of this. So let's start with some of the examples from the book. The servant can perform simple tasks such as fetching things, cleaning, mending, folding clothes, lighting fire, serving food, and pouring wine. Now your servant can't attack directly, but there are other ways around it. If you did want to deal a little bit of damage, there's nothing stopping you dropping some caltrops using your Unseen Servant, so that's already something you can do with it. You're not always going to need your bonus action, so as an hour-long duration, non-concentration spell, Unseen Servant is useful in those little situations if you want it to control the battlefield in some way. But as I said before, damage isn't really your thing. The control aspect of caltrops is nice, so it's definitely worth looking into. But at the same time, there's also much more that the servant can be doing. Unseen Servants have an AC, a hit point value, and a strength value. So not only are they useful for manipulating objects, but they can also be manipulated by other things. So if you have the servant carry a robe, for instance, then another creature might conceive of it as another target. And even though it might only be able to withstand one hit, that's one sword swing, that's one arrow, that's one spell that's not coming your way. Unseen Servant is great for creating distractions. Even though it itself is invisible, the things that it moves are not. And anytime something is moving of its own accord, it's very often that something is going to want to investigate, perhaps giving you the chance to sneak by or gain an advantage or a surprise against that thing. An Unseen Servant can push a heavy object down a corridor, which could potentially set off traps that are activated by pressure or by motion. And of course the Unseen Servant can get things for you that you yourself cannot reach, so things behind a barred gate, that lever over the other side of the pit, or potentially grab a small object which you can see through a crack in the wall. This spell is available to wizards, bards, and warlocks, and it's too good a spell to pass up. I could honestly spend an entire video just talking about this one spell alone, but it's so good it should definitely be considered for your utility repertoire. I think Calm Emotions is one of those overlooked spells that has a lot of potential if you know what you're doing with it. So first of all, it's a spell that has multiple effects, the first of which being is it can completely negate any charmed or frightened effect. It might not sound like much, but charmed and frightened are two conditions that will absolutely stop a party member in their tracks. The second effect the spell has is to take a creature from hostile to indifferent. Again, it's something that shouldn't be overlooked. You can very easily prevent a whole encounter from taking place if you just target the right person with Calm Emotions. The reason I would consider this one of my go-to spells is because of the resource economy that comes with it. If you can prevent that encounter in the first instance, then you're not using up valuable hit points, you're not using up valuable spell slots, and you're just being able to make better use of the time both in and out of game. I know this spell doesn't seem like much to many of you, but I know there are going to be people who have tossed out the occasional charm person now and again. And if that's the case, then always remember that turnabout is fair play. I've seen so many parties that are prepared for a toe-to-toe fight have put lots of resources into keeping their HP totals high, and by also making sure that their armor class is really, really good. But as soon as something like Charm Person or Fear hits the battlefield, everyone goes into disarray and nobody knows what to do. So having Calm Emotions in your back pocket is an absolute lifesaver. Calm Emotions is a second level spell for bards, clerics, and archfey warlocks. So it seems that bards are doing quite well here, because this next spell is available to bards as well. In addition to that, it's also available to sorcerers, wizards, and Great Old One warlocks. That spell is Detect Thoughts, and if I could only ever cast one spell again for the rest of my gaming career, it would probably be this. Again, this is another multi-function spell. You can use it for probing a creature's thoughts directly, or you can use it as an area effect spell, which allows you to detect the presence of thinking creatures, and as such, that's something that's really powerful. Because it doesn't matter if the creature is polymorphed, it doesn't matter if it's invisible, it doesn't matter if it's hiding. As long as it's thinking, or it has the potential to think, you can be aware of it within the selected area. My only real gripes with this spell is that it's a fairly short duration, and I would prefer a little bit more radius, but I think if it did have those things, it would just be far too powerful. So for what it does, I think it's a reasonable compromise. One of the most important aspects of any spellcaster, in my opinion, is their ability to control the battlefield. So now we're going to look at some of the controlling options available to the spellcasting classes. As far as tier 1 goes, I'd say Grease is probably one of my favourite controlling spells, especially for first level. It's only available to wizards, but that's not really an issue. So this is a nice basic spell in the beginning because it's simply dexterity or full prone, and it lasts for a minute duration. But that's the real key to this spell. It lasts for 1 minute, and it's non-concentration based. So it's a reasonable spell to cast underneath your targets, but what I think tends to get overlooked sometimes is the fact that it's a duration spell that's quite obvious in effect, and creatures will see the effects and they will want to move around it, and therein lies the controlling element of this spell. Yes, it can control by keeping things on the ground, but essentially what it's doing is it's forcing creatures to take an alternative route to get to the party, and in doing so they can potentially leave themselves open to a surprise or an advantage. Grease is ultimately a great spell simply because of the fact that it doesn't require any concentration, and in doing so you can have multiple control spells on the go at one time, meaning you can really tailor the battlefield to your liking. So initially I was thinking of Web as one of my go-to spells, but I genuinely prefer Gust of Wind. Web is similar in intent to Grease anyway, so it's nice to have something a little bit different as well. So first and foremost, everything within the line has to make a strength save or be pushed back. So up to 15 feet is a fair amount of distance, and as I've said to you multiple times, you can push them into potential traps or over cliffs or into hazards, so there's already the controlling element there. This is an impressive spell though, because it affects creatures of all size. There's nothing in the description that says there's any upper limit to the size of the creature that you can push. Whilst creatures will still have higher strength values at higher levels and have better saving throws, you can still potentially affect them with it. But even if they do manage to pass their saving throw, they still have to spend 2 feet of movement for every 1 foot of movement they wish to take. I'm a big fan of spells that allow you to continue to do things despite the fact that a creature may have saved against it. So you'll always get the effect where they have to spend additional movement in order to get closer to you. Combined with movement reduction spells like Ray of Frost, or environmental hazards such as difficult terrain, and you can really lock down creatures that are relying upon getting close to you in order to deal their damage. Additionally, you have the flexibility to aim the spell each round using a bonus action, so you're getting a little bit more out of it rather than having a static effect in one place. And the utility that also comes with this spell is also really good. Its ability to disperse vapors and gases and extinguish non-protected fires, and even the potential to extinguish protected fires if you get a decent roll, can be very useful in multiple situations. A 10-foot wide, 60-foot line is an enormous amount of area to be covering, so this spell is a great addition for characters like druids, sorcerers, or wizards. So I'm guessing some of you are thinking that Hold Person would probably be on this list, and while it is an amazing spell, there are certain limitations to it that mean it's not as useful in certain situations. So this spell creates an illusion in the target's mind, and the target, on a failed save, reacts to that illusion as though it were a physical or tactile thing. Because the creature reacts to it as though it were real, it will want to take actions which it deems are relative to the situation, so as such, it will probably consider moving around the object in question. Also, if a creature is convinced that a damaging illusion is real, it will potentially keep it at bay as well. Sensible creatures aren't going to want to walk through an area that's damaging them, so it's a good way to get them to go around it. Or if there is no way around, it will keep them at bay long enough for you to make your escape. The out-of-combat utility on this spell is also really amazing. You might be able to convince a guard that there is a threat somewhere else that they need to go and deal with. You might be able to convince a worker that something is broken or damaged and they might go off and fix it. This spell might have a few little caveats that don't allow it to work in certain situations, such as not affecting things like undead or constructs, but at least it doesn't have the caveat of only being usable against something like humanoids. And the amount of potential that you can have with this spell, either in or out of combat, make it an absolutely amazing pick, and one that creative players will get a lot of joy out of. This spell is available to bards, sorcerers, wizards, and both Archfey and Great Old One warlocks, so you're getting so much potential. So this is a really accessible spell, and the things you can do with it if you have a creative mind just make this an amazing tier 1 selection. Support isn't often necessary, although sometimes somewhat unfulfilling of a role that most parties need to take advantage of. As such, having the right tools for the job is often the difference between life and death. I find Healing Word to be my preferred of the healing spells. Yes, Cure Wounds is more powerful, but Healing Word is much faster. Castable as a bonus action, this frees up your action for other things. There have been numerous times when I've seen the cleric having to come to the decision of whether or not to heal a party member or go off and do something else and potentially get further forward in the encounter. Healing Word takes away the stress of having to deal with that decision. If you look at it in that context, it actually becomes a very, very useful spell. You can throw out the heal and stabilize the creature you need to, and go off and start doing other things that are necessary to prevent further damage. Healing Word might not be the most efficient of spells, but it's useful in a pinch, and that's where it really comes into play. Most characters these days are very self-sufficient. They have access to things like resistance, spells and abilities that they can use to heal, such as things like Second Wind, and you can heal off all the damage in a complete night's rest. So essentially, you only need to use this for combat healing. Most of the time, you're not going to have to worry too much about using out-of-combat healing spells, because there are other effects and abilities that will do that job for you. As such, Healing Word becomes very useful in the fact that if something terrible happens, a quick stabilization heal, and you can carry on and do whatever else you need to. A very useful spell for any bard, cleric, or druid whose party has their backs to the wall. If you've ever had a run-in with a carrion crawler or a similar creature, you'll know how devastating paralyzed and poisoned can be. Always make sure you're carrying Lesser Restoration around with you. Being able to get rid of any disease that you happen to come across, or being able to get rid of blindness, deafness, poison, or paralysis is incredibly useful. I have actually seen players just try to wait out the paralysis. Rather than actually go over and heal their paralyzed companion, they will just leave them there and continue doing what they're doing. And then the other player is sat there going, well, I can't do anything. So not only is it useful for actually improving your odds of survival in an encounter, but it gives the players something to do when a terrible condition strikes. So make sure you carry the spell with you and cast it whenever you need to. There's a reason why this spell is so available, and it's because it's so necessary. You can get it for bards, clerics, druids, pallies, rangers. They've made it really accessible because it's a useful spell that everyone should really consider having in their arsenal. Aid is one of those rare jewels when it comes to spell selection. 8-hour duration, 3 targets, 0 concentration. The spell is really good, and it does something that most spells don't do, and it increases your maximum hit points. Because it's a natural hit point increase, anytime you take damage, you'll be able to heal those back up again, so you'll always be above what you would normally have. Additionally, you can stack temporary hit points on top of those as well. This spell scales really well as well, so you get an additional 5 hit points for every spell level above 2nd that you use. So for example, you use a 4th level spell, you get 15 additional hit points. That's 15 true hit points that can be healed if necessary, or if you don't need them at the end of the 8-hour duration, let the spell drop off, and then you haven't really lost anything either. so it's a very good use of resources in my opinion. This is a great spell to set you up for the adventuring day, and it also has the potential to prevent having to cast multiple cure spells by setting up the ability to give multiple people in the party additional hit points. An enhancement spell, or a buff spell as most people call them, takes some aspect of the character upon which they're cast and improves it. That's all that really needs to be said about buffs. Buff spells are often necessary, however, especially in combats where you're having to deal with multiple attackers, because you want to get those benefits when it comes to dealing with each and every creature in front of you. It's typically very wise to improve your own situation, considering the fact that most of the time, prevention is better than cure. Bless is a spell that's available to both clerics and paladins, and it's one that's come in more handy than I care to remember. Bless starts off by improving your accuracy, and at low level it's one of the most necessary things you can get. You can have all the best feats and all the best attacks, but if none of them are landing, then they're of no value to you. Bless helps to improve that, and it helps to improve it for multiple creatures. Bless also improves your saving throws, and you don't need me to tell you that there are a bunch of nasty conditions that you'd just rather not have on your character. It's also a spell that scales very well, increasing the number of targets that you can put this effect on, so you only need to cast as high a level spell slot as you have members in the party. The spell affects 3 creatures at first level and 1 more for every additional spell level you put into it, so if you've only got 4 people in your party, then a second level spell is sufficient to get this effect on every one of them. Enhanceability is another one of those spells that's available to a huge amount of characters: bards, clerics, druids, sorcerers, wizards. Advantage on ability checks isn't always the easiest thing to get, but it's often something that's very necessary. Also, it's worth remembering that this spell scales very well as well. For every spell slot above second, you can target an additional creature. This spell makes you adaptable to a wide variety of situations on the fly, so it's worth having as a backup. So I just had to include Enlarge Reduce. This is one of my absolute favourite spells. I understand it's not one of the best, I understand it's not everyone's go-to, but it's just got this amazing combination of debilitation, enhancement, and utility. So for the enhancement portion of this spell, you can improve a creature's damage, you can improve its strength saving throws, you can improve its strength checks, and for the debilitation side of this spell, the opposite is true. The utility aspect is amazing as well. Doubling something's size can fill up a whole tunnelway or a whole corridor so that creatures can't get to you. Being able to reduce an object potentially allows you to hide it. This is a really good spell. It's fun to use. It's got uses in and out of combat. It's good for buffing. It's got some debuff potential as well. I really like it. I would say it's one of my go-tos, but that's more a personal thing for me. Your go-to might be different, but this spell, it's just a laugh a minute. If any of you guys are using Enlarge and Reduce, let me know in the comment section. Tell me how it's affected the encounters you've had at your table. I think people tend to use the terms debuff and debilitation interchangeably, when I see them as being 2 different things. So I think debilitations tend to be more control based, so things like slow for example, whereas debuffs I think tend to just reduce damage output, or they increase the amount of hit point damage that you take from certain attacks, so they actively affect the amount of numerics that you're dealing with. I think Hex is a good example of this. A creature takes additional damage from the spell as part of the Hex, that's the debuff element, but the debilitation would come in the form of the disadvantage that you would get on the ability checks. I would say a good rule of thumb would be to ask yourself, is this affecting their output or the amount of damage that they're receiving? If the answer is yes, it's probably a debuff. Is it affecting the things that they can do physically? Then it's probably a debilitation. While it might not seem like much in the grand scheme of things, looking at it from this angle, you can define for yourself what it is your character is doing. As such, I think that understanding these differences can help your overall casting efficiency. Understand that characters that cast curses have a much harder time of it than characters that cast buffs, because you're having to affect a target. They usually get a saving throw against it as well in many situations. And additionally, once that creature has been affected and then disposed of, you usually can't move that curse onto something else. You're going to have to cast again. So making the best use of the curses available to you is not the easiest thing to do. Characters who cast curses, I think, have to be very selective about the creatures they target, for when that creature is dealt with, that spell no longer has any more use. This is why I love Hex so much, because once you're done with it, you can move it onto something else, and you can continue to use it for the entire duration. This is what makes it such an amazing spell to have in your arsenal, especially as a first level tier 1 spell. Also, Hex has no saving throw. As we discussed earlier, many curses require you to make a saving throw, and in that case it's usually all or nothing. At least with Hex, you can put it on whatever creature you like, whenever you like, and they cannot get rid of it. This makes it a really efficient cast. Additionally, you can use this spell multiple times if you're using a higher level spell slot. So a third level spell slot will allow you to use this for up to 8 hours, so you can continually bounce it from one target to another. But even the first level spell slot gives you an hour duration on this. If you're going through a tightly packed dungeon where you're expecting a lot of encounters, then you can use it, move on for a few minutes, and when the next creature comes along, use a bonus action to hex that. Hex and the Ranger equivalent Hunter's Mark are excellent spells because they're very useful for characters that have a low amount of spell slots. So Bane is available to bards and clerics and some specific archetypes like chaos-based divine soul sorcerers. If you can get this spell to stick, then it's a great debuff, reducing creatures' attack output and making them more vulnerable to spells that require a saving throw. There's some wonderful synergy between things like Bane, Cutting Words, Vicious Mockery, and I used to use them all the time when I was playing a Drow Bard. If you can get Bane to stick, then they're more vulnerable to Vicious Mockery, so that's disadvantage plus an additional d4 of attack roll lost, and if you still need more on top of that, Cutting Words is always available. This is a really frustrating combination to be on the other end of, so if you're going to use it, I suggest hiding behind another player at the table because you're likely to get a book thrown at you. So next up is Ray of Enfeeblement. Now I know that this isn't the best of spells, but remember that this section is about debuffs, and the way I perceive debuffs, in the sense that they reduce things like outgoing damage, and they enhance things like incoming damage. So in the case of Ray of Enfeeblement, it's a spell that reduces outgoing damage from your target. This is a potentially good spell, but it's just difficult to make it work. But what it does is worth the effort if you can make it stick. So abilities like the Divinus Portent is very good for getting it on there in the first place. However, it's constitution based. So they're saving versus constitution and it affects strength based attacks. Typically these brute style creatures with a high strength will have a good constitution as well. So being able to keep this on for multiple rounds might be difficult. But if you have a creature that's dealing multiple attacks, being able to half the damage from each of those is really useful in the long term. This spell really comes into its own, however, if you've got some support from other party members. We were talking about Bane earlier, and Bane is a charisma based saving throw, so you might find that one of your party members can get that spell to stick a lot easier. If that's the case, then they're going to get a reduction to their saving throws, allowing you to then cast Ray of Enfeeblement, and that saving throw and all the subsequent saving throws that they'll make each round will ultimately be reduced. This is a nice way that two characters can actually complement each other when it comes to casting their curses. So one person gets to put Bane on, which can potentially stop them from landing any attacks in the first place, but if they are lucky enough to get through, at least those attacks won't hurt so much. Sure, there might be some better debilitating curses within tier 1, but when it comes to actually debuffing, I don't think that Ray of Enfeeblement is actually that bad, providing you've got some support to make it work. Personally, I feel that as a spellcaster, the last thing on your mind should be blowing things up. Even so, however, even I take a few damaging spells from time to time, but I usually pick ones that serve a specific purpose. Magic Missile is a spell that stood the test of time. It's a 120 foot range multi-target no save force effect. I also have a little bit of a soft spot for this spell because it's the first one I ever cast during my very first game of Dungeons & Dragons. 20 years may have rolled on since then, but the spell is still as useful as it ever was. But mostly I find it useful because it's a force effect. I still believe that as a spellcaster, the party is going to look to you to solve a lot of their problems. One of those problems I tend to find is ethereal creatures, so things like shadows, ghosts, spectres. Most of them have resistances to most elemental effects, and even flat out immunity to things like necrotic or poison, and sometimes cold as well. But they don't have any resistance when it comes to force effects. Yes, some classes like Warlocks, for example, have cantrips that use force effects, but relying on that one character to do all the work is going to be a little bit difficult, especially if anything happens to them. So having something you can fall back on to help in those situations, Magic Missile's a good choice. If you are fortunate enough to have 2 arcane spellcasters in the group, one Warlock and one either Sorcerer or Wizard, then you'll be able to decimate opponents at long range with your force effects, no save, and then quickly get on to the next round, because again, this is such a good spell. It's already auto-targeting, you don't have to roll to hit, there's no save against it, you just roll the damage and you're on to the next part of the game. This next spell's a little bit more available when it comes to the character classes, so it's available to characters like Bards, Druids, Sorcerers, Wizards, Storm Clerics, so there's a good bit of variety there. Thunderwave is a 15-foot cube, which does moderate damage. There's a saving throw versus it for half, but it also has the potential to push a target back up to 10 feet. And this is what I personally like about spells. I like spells that do multiple things. So having that pushback allows you to control the battlefield more. Also, objects that fit wholly within the cube will also be pushed if they're not secured. So anything up to 15 foot in any direction is potentially something you can move. So you get a little bit of utility, and you have the capacity to potentially move some of the battlefield around to your liking. The only real drawback to this spell is the audible boom that can be heard up to 300 feet away, so if you're on some kind of stealth mission, it's of no value to you. But at the same time, I think if you really abuse the mechanics of the spell, really look at what it can do and how it can manipulate not only creatures but objects as well, I think that's definitely worth having in your selection of spells. So when it comes to spells that deal damage in an area, I'm very fond of Shatter. The damage is fairly moderate, it's very good against creatures. There's a saving throw versus this one, but then again, so are most area effect spells. Creatures that are made of stone, crystal, metal, they have disadvantage against it, so that's not so bad, it's a nice little added extra. But what I really like about Shatter is the effect that it has on objects. So this spell affects non-magical items that aren't being worn or carried. So things like barricades, for example. If a creature has some cover, Shatter might not only deal some damage to it, but it could also potentially deal enough damage to knock down one of their barricades, preventing them from having cover anymore. This spell could destroy a weapon rack, so that creatures can't get weapons to attack you with. It could destroy a shelf full of potions, because the bottles themselves are not magical. You might need to bump this spell up a few levels in order to get enough damage to destroy something large, like a cart for example. If you look on page 246, 247 of the DM's guide, it'll tell you about objects and hit points. This page will give you a rough idea of how many hit points objects have, so you can work out for yourself just how much power you need to put into your spell in order to completely destroy the object that you're casting it at. This is another fairly available spell, including such classes as Bards, Warlocks, Sorcerers, Wizards, and Tempest Clerics. Keep the spell handy because there's a lot of value in being able to damage objects as well as creatures. So those are some of my thoughts on spells. Admittedly, I might think a little differently about them than some other people, but you do what works for you. Hopefully you guys got something out of that, and with any luck you were entertained along the way. If you like what's going on here, be sure to leave a like, it really helps to promote the channel. If you want to tell me about your particular go-to spells, or you'd like me to do more things like this in the future, leave a comment down below, because the comments really do drive the content on this channel, because it's all for you guys. And also, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, why not consider doing so? There's a great community of people here, all putting in their information, all putting in their experiences, and hopefully having a really good time doing it. And with all that being said, I will see you guys next time at the gaming table.